All right, so what we have here is the Mayday session. I'm gonna break it down for you guys today. I don't really do these, but I want to bring you guys into my process of how I approach not only the beat, but also thinking a couple more steps ahead about how it turns into a song. And by no means this is a disclaimer. I'm not an expert, but I will bring you guys into my process and what I've learned over the years of teaching myself and then learning cheat codes from different people I've met and ran into and breaking a couple rules here and there. In the session right now, we have the complete beat in Ableton. I use Ableton. I used to use Fruity Loops, but I found that Ableton has just been a lot more efficient when it comes to producing, arranging, even recording, and actually building out a full song. There's just a little bit more you can do than FL Studio, but of course, FL Studio is the GOAT for drums and the drum sequencer. Nothing beats it, but I'm on Ableton now. So I'll start with the melody and shout out Oliver for sending the melody. It's a beautiful sample and it caught my ear because it felt like Ginger as far as the palette of what I was hearing during the time of just music out there in the culture on the radio, little stuff on Instagram. It just felt fresh, new, light, and freeing in a way. So I'll start with that and show you guys the melody. Okay, so that's the melody. And the minute I heard that, it brought me back to being like 12 years old and enjoying during, middle school. I would listen to a lot of dubstep and EDM. That was really my first point of feeling the bug of wanting to make music and listening to whether it was Skrillex or really underground DJs like Tristan and all these different Monster Cat DJs that you would find on YouTube. I was really inspired by that sound. And so when I heard the melody and the vocal chops, it was really nostalgic in the sense. And that's always been something within my spirit of trying to figure out how to make that texture of EDM and dubstep digestible in the hip hop lens. And when I heard this sample, I was like, oh, this is an opportunity to do that. So from the sample, I started with hearing the bass line. And so I started with a bass synth, and it's a synth from, let's see what this plugin is, Spire. And so all I'm doing is layering the bass that I hear underneath the sample, but I think in the sample it had a filter on it, so you weren't really feeling the low end. So from there, with the sample, you have the bass line. From there, I continued to look through, I think it was Spire, and find more bass synths to fill up the low end of the beat. The next bass synth I found was this really grungy synth. It's called BA Growl. And my intention with this one was to kind of give some contrast to the beat because the sample sounded so pretty and airy, and now it just needed a little bit of grit. So that synth sounds like this. And then right here you see I just bring it up an octave from where it was originally at. So it's still the same sound, but it's just one octave up when it goes into the verse. And then from here, I feel the low end. The sample's already doing so much work as far as driving the overall mood of the beat. Okay, from there, I start with the drums. And so immediately going from bass to bass, I start with the 808. And it's just a simple spins 808, go-to classic, gets the job done. It's the perfect sample to start with if you want to manipulate and then sound design a more distinct 808. But for this one, it just sounded perfect off the bat. And then as far as trying to make the bass sound a little more unique, I was relying more so on the bass synth to add that texture to the low end punch that the 808 was doing. So from there, I'll mute it so it's just the 808. So all it's doing is following that same bass line that's inside the sample and is in this bass synth right here. So together, when you come to the verse and the hook of when the beat actually drops, you have the grittier bass. And now those two together, the gritty bass mixed with the 808, you get this. And so the combination of both is really giving a lot of energy to the low end of the beat. And if it was to just be the 808, it would be a lot more boring, and you can hear it right now just with the sample and the 808. You feel the punch of the 808, but there needs to be something down there in the low end to keep the mood going. So both together, it sounds a lot more full and interesting. And that's something I do often. And if you're ever in a situation where you're wondering, as you're doing a bass line or adding an 808, and you know the 808 hits, you like the pattern, you love the sample that you use, but something still feels off or the overall beat still feels light, usually what it is you need to add another instrument or a layer of that same 808 with a crazy effect to fill up the low end. Because if you don't, then you get that effect where it just feels like you feel a punch from the 808, or if it's a bass synth and you like the notes, but it's not quite gluing everything together what you're trying to articulate. From there, after the basses, I moved on to the kick. And I have two kicks here. One's just a regular kick, and I'll mute that or solo that so you can hear it. And all this is doing is following the pattern and accenting a couple pockets in between the 808. Right? And then underneath that kick, you have the second kick, and this kick just comes on the turnarounds to add a texture and it's more of a stomp. And so you'll hear that with the other kick. And then when you add that with the 808, you get this. And then when you add the bass synth, and so now at this point, the bass and the low end, which is really the most important part of a beat and a song, is if you fuck up the low end, the song's kind of it's not going to be as effective of cutting through, and it's just not going to sound glued together. So make sure that you're in love with it and it's very interesting and keeps you excited is so important, because if the low end does not make sense, if it's not cutting through, you're just going to struggle and overcompensate with adding more stuff within the beat, where that glue and that excitement should really come from a really strong low end 808 bass synth, or a combination of both, like you see right here. When I go in and start a beat, the first checklist is, does the low end hit? Does the 808 hit? Does the bass synth hit? While it's hitting, does it sound good? Is there good chemistry with also what's going on with the melody, with the vocals, and making sure that fine balance of making it exciting, but also making sure that it's not taking up too much space and it's actually eating up the whole song. So after that, I go on to perks and I start with hi-hats. And during this beat, I remember I do a process where essentially I'm not afraid of starting over. And that's important too when approaching a beat, is you initially hear in your intuition how it should sound, and then you follow that, but you should also be prepared to abandon that in the discovery and exploration of actually being in the creative flow. And so with the hi-hats, I tried probably every pocket you could try for this BPM, whether it was triplets, 16th notes, quarter notes, eighth notes, staggered off the grid notes, and doing some bounce shit with some rolls. I tried it all, but what felt best was just the two-step hi-hat. And so that sounds like this. And so now with the hi-hats there, you have the combination of the hi-hats and the bass. The hi-hats took it to a whole other level of excitement, where now the pocket's there, the tempo's established, and you're just locked into the bounce. And from there, I added another hi-hat. It's literally just a single note. Even when we went into mixing, I was debating removing it because it wasn't really doing much, but it's more so something that's just felt and not really heard. And it kind of acts as an accent snare, but I just like the texture of the hi-hat itself, and replace that pocket with the sound of a hi-hat, but the intention was for it to be a snare. Then from there, open hat. Then another open hat, and as you hear, it's just filling in the little pockets to give it more bounce, but not overdoing it. And that open hat is acting more like a crash and layering that stomp kick that we went over earlier on the turnarounds to make each downbeat feel that much more impactful. And it's not really turned up too loud, but it just adds that extra crunch. And that's something I've noticed when you also want to make your 808 or kick cut through that much more on top of the rabbit hole of layering your bass, whether it's having an 808 with a bass synth or an 808, and then you duplicate it and you add distortion to it. Also, most of the time, if you're not getting the sound or transient punch that you're looking for, it's because your bass itself should cover the full frequency spectrum. So where an open hat comes into place with that is that if you layer your kick with an open hat, now you're filling up the complete spectrum. So when that initial punch happens, your ears are hearing the low end thump and also the high end crisp of the open hat. So it just sounds like it's important when it's coming through the speakers because you're hearing all of it, not just low end rumbles. You're hearing the crispness of the hi-hat. And together, if you have a soft clipper, that adds a whole other layer to it, because now if you have two of those instruments hitting at the same time, now your clipper is going to crunch the overall sound even more, and it's going to sound just really warm, crunchy, punchy, like all the things you're looking for. It comes down to layering. Then I moved on to a perk. It's like a little chant. So with the beat, it sounds like this. So it's just making it more exciting. Again, I'm accenting the downbeats. Every time that bass hits on the one, you're hearing that perk hit. And then the last perk is this random, weird little sound. Everything so far, minus the snares, which I'll go in right now. Okay, so from there, I think even during the time, I'm not quite sure, but I think I did actually save the snare for last because it was just making sure the hi-hats caught the ear as far as establishing the pocket, and then the kick, the 808, and the bass were doing work and making the overall low and exciting. And then finally, the easiest thing was just adding a snare. And I think right here, it's 3 snares. The first one's the main one. So it's a unique tonal metallic snare, and then underneath that I actually have just your regular sounding snare, because that metallic tonal snare, although it has a nice sound, it doesn't quite have the transient punch of a traditional snare. And then together you have both. So all that did, it's the same philosophy with the 808. When you have a snare, it could sound dope, it could sound interesting, but you also want to make sure that it fills up the frequency that it needs to fill up for you to actually feel something and bob your head. And so sometimes, just like bass, a snare could feel too light, and usually what you need to do if you really love that sound, find another snare that covers the frequency range that you want to fill up but not take up that exciting part of the first snare. Layer them together, and then you'll have a full sounding snare. And then from there, I added an accent snare to cover the offbeats and give it more of a pocket, and that sounds like this. It's not taking up too much space. It's actually more of a snare that has some reverb to it, and it does what it needs to do. It's actually hitting the same pocket as that hi-hat earlier. From there, then we go later in the verse, and something that happens right before the second hook is this perk loop, and it sounds like this. And then also in the verse, you have some new melodies coming in. And actually, this first one happens before that perk loop comes in, and that sounds like this. It's probably like one of my favorite sounds in the whole beat. And all that is just a random synth loop, but with a lot of processing. So without the effects, it sounds like this. Let's see. And then I just threw on Ableton stock vocoder to change up the texture a little bit because it was a little too much with the sample already. So that calmed it down a little bit, and then guitar rig, I'm not sure what that's doing, but I think it's adding some more distortion to it. So it actually made it mono, which during making the beat, it helped out because the drums were already doing a lot. Bass synth was already taking up a lot of space as a melody in itself, even though it's the bass, but it's that really distorted synth. So that helped control that sound. And then the next sound in the verse is this lead, which went through a bunch of time stretching and printing to get it to sound weird like this. So I don't think I saved my steps as far as this one, but you could see in here, Ableton's algorithm for stretching samples is one of the best algorithms across any DAW that I've personally worked with. And I don't remember what I did. I was probably just tweaking random buttons, but you can see I'm messing with the format, the envelope, and then I think even before printing this version of the lead, I time stretched it twice, maybe reduced it, and then got it to where it's at. And that's why it sounds so really airy. And the Ableton time stretch feature does that to pretty much anything you throw it into. So with that all together, it sounds like this once you get to the end of the verse. And then the beginning of the verse with that first lead. Then from there is the first pre-hook, I guess. It's not really a traditional pre-hook, it's just the beat breaks off back into the main sample after the verse. And so from there you get to this point. And then you go back into the second hook. Then from there we get into the second verse, and just like the first verse, I like to stray away from using the sample to give the overall song a switch up and create a new world. And so with that is this vocal chop right here that becomes the main melody and also percussive element too. On the synth box, you could see here, there's actually a really dope stock Ableton plugin that I love using on my drums to switch up and also as like a learning tool to help find pockets when doing drums, and that's beat repeat. I use this probably in every other beat, and so let's actually solo that. So without it, let's see what it sounds like. Right, so without it, it sounds like some Brazilian funk. With it, you can see it repeats the first initial chop that you hear. Without it, with it. And sometimes that becomes such a really useful tool because you can be in a lot of moments and making something and you really, really love the sound, whether it's a drum or a melody, you love the texture, it's so unique in itself, but it's just not fitting the pocket of what you're trying to do for the song or the beat. And it's heartbreaking because sometimes you have to let it go, and whether that's just deleting it or of course you save it for another beat, but it does hurt when you find something really dope and it's just like, damn, why isn't this making sense right now? And something like this helps you find that pocket that you could find if you spent hours trying to process of elimination and go through every single rhythm that you could do. But something that like this initially right away gives you that inspiration or fits it into the pocket that you hear. That with the bass line. And then you have a new snare, and this snare sounds like this. And then from there, it drops back into the drums that you hear in the first verse, just with the new vocal chop. Then when we get to the end of the second verse, some new things come in, another perk loop, and that loop sounds like this. And then also I'm bringing in a piece of the sample itself, which is just this guitar, to be in that section, along with a solo bass synth from the sample. So this is the filtered bass synth that was originally in the sample, not the super heavy one that I added. Then you got the snares. And then the main part of the sample comes back in, and now it's just a stripped down version of the hook, just with the snare, the perk loops, the sample, and the bass synth. And that's it. And so I want to make sure I didn't miss any plugins within these specific tracks. And as I'm scrolling through, you could see it's all very basic, and it's like the cliche quote you hear every producer who's seasoned and been doing it for a long time. It's, if you start with good sounds, you really don't got to doctor up your sounds after the fact. And if you do doctor them up, it should be more creative than fixing. You should never, when you get that creative spark, you should never spend the majority of the time trying to clean up a sound as you're trying to produce. Save that for the mixing end, but when you're in that flow, you should not be in engineer mode. You should just be throwing shit at the wall and having fun. And so a big part of making sure you stay in that is just along your ways finding really good drum samples. So I mean, in every track here you could see it's just the drum sample, stock utility from Ableton, maybe a light EQ here, but even on all of these perks and hi-hats, there's nothing. It's literally just the drum sample being thrown in there. And I remember also to not be, because across every other beat video breakdown that I see, there's always, those producers who say, yeah, you don't need really good speakers or really good equipment. I made this on headphones and laptop speakers, and ironically, because I laugh at that, it's like, all right, cool. But this beat I did make on laptop speakers, so that is a testimony too, where if you're just having fun, it really doesn't matter where or what environment you're in to make a really good idea that turns into something special. So as you can see, still going through the snares, it's just the drum sample. The sample is just the sample, and the bass synth too, just the bass synth. There's no effects. From there, my master bus is really simple. I swear by standard clip. It glues everything together, and a lot of times people who are making beats for the first time, there's always a disconnect, and I didn't know for the longest time until I found standard clip of why I knew I had the dopest drum samples, whether it was ones I found or ones I knew people were using that were making beats that I loved. But even in the process of making, I'm like, why is my shit not hitting like that? Or why does the texture not sound in a way expensive or in your face? And standard clip, there's so many out now, but I've had this probably for 4 years, and it has been a lifesaver in just making your drums and melodies in its own way cut through. And in the plugin, there's a bunch of algorithms where it's not just soft clipping, you have hard clipping, and then you have two forms of soft clipping. And then the plugin also adds its own saturation, which gives that color and warmth and grittiness without the crunchy distortiness to your drums. Beyond standard clip, I just use Pro L2, and there's nothing fancy going on in here. I'm not adjusting any of these settings, and to be honest, I don't even, on a scholarly level, I don't even know what these really do. So I just kind of keep it how it is, and I'm using the wide and open preset, where I think that one doesn't slam the levels too hard, and there are some in here that you could get that sound, but I love having dynamics in my music. I don't like compressing too much. I don't like slamming too much. I like the peaks and valleys within the sounds of a beat, where something sounds super in your face, something sounds super far back, something sounds really quiet, something sounds really loud, because all those little things add to making the beat turn into something bigger than what it is, and it feels alive. And so when you start compressing too much, or you add too many limiters, OTT, it just starts to turn into like a brick wall of sound that can be dope for some applications, but most of the time it's just almost straining on the ear. I'm gonna unmute everything and just let everything play from start to finish, and that is the complete beat for Mayday. that's it. So thank you to everyone, Oliver, Sebastian, John Scott. We all came together and did our thing on this, and it turned into something really beautiful and special, and kicked off a really important period in all of our lives with, of course, everything that you guys now know as the beacon and the evolution of Zone and this new space that we're in, and curating this experience for you guys. So more importantly, thank you to you guys for showing all the love and support, to everyone who purchased the beacon, to everyone who listened to this song. It means the world, and we got a lot more coming out soon. So thank you guys.